Okay. All right. I'd like to welcome everyone very much to our celebration and launch of Sarah Dowse's second edition, new edition of West Block. We'll just give people a few minutes to make sure that everyone's here, and then we'll kick off. But while we're doing that, I will hold the beautiful stuff. There it is in all its glory. And we're very proud of it. Published by For Pity's Sake Publishing under Jen McDonald's care and administration, and with a new author's note at the beginning. We have a large number of people joining us from around Australia and indeed from overseas, and I welcome everybody to our Zoom session. Such a shame that we can't all gather in the room, but this will have to do us for now. I will acknowledge that where we're sitting, Richard and I, and the Living Arts Canberra team as we're sitting in Ngunnawal country, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, to the traditional owners of the country, and acknowledge their stewardship of the land and the language and the culture. People at this session, of course, will be sitting on other traditional lands, and I acknowledge all of those traditional owners, wherever you may be. This revision of West Block comes at a very timely moment, I think, in our history. First published in 1983, and really Sarah Dowse hardly needs introduction, so I won't give her one. I'll let the seminar itself do that. Michele Seminara, thank you so much for being our inquisitor today and keeping us all engaged with your questions. There will be an opportunity for everyone who's here to ask questions using the chat function. So anytime you can type those things in, and around about 10:45, we'll take some of those questions. If we don't have time for all of your questions, do not fret. We will collect them all and send them off to Sarah, and when she can, she will answer them and we'll post them onto the For Pity's Sake website and the Living Arts Canberra website. I also want to let you know that the session is being recorded, and if you can't make it into the Zoom session today, there will be an opportunity for people to see that and hear that whole book launch on our website and on the For Pity's Sake website. You'll get an email if you enrolled tomorrow, I think, and we'll follow up with you on all of those things. While I'm still in commercial mode and before I hand over to our guest celebrities, I want to let you know that if you go to the For Pity's Sake website, forpitysake.com.au, Jen has put up some wonderful offers for you. The first 30 people to order a copy of this book from the website, where you will get a 25% discount, will also receive a beautiful West Block travel candle. So that's all of our commercial sale, and I'll remind you about that later. If you've already ordered, Jen will also candle to you so that you won't miss out. Well, I think at this point I will now hand over to Michele Seminara to be the inquisitor, as I said, to grill Sarah Dowse about the contents and the intent of this wonderful novel, first published in 1993 and now republished in all its 2020 of all years. So thank you so much to Michele and Sarah, and we'll just click on the screen and hand over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbie. I'm so honoured to be here today to talk to Sarah. She is a legend of Australian literature, and I don't know about being her inquisitor. I think it's just going to be a wonderful chat, and she's got some amazing stories because she's lived through and shaped and written about incredible times in Australian history. So thank you so much, Sarah, for chatting with me today. I wanted to ask, my first question is about the block itself, the West Block, which is actually on the cover of the book. It's a stunning cover. So it's actually a building, one of the original buildings of Parliament. Could you tell us a bit about that and how you came to first work there?
Oh, yes. Well, the building, when Canberra was finally built, the original buildings in what was called the Parliamentary Triangle was what we now call Old Parliament House. And then on the east side of the triangle was, East Block, and on the west side was West Block. And between those two buildings, all of the public service, as we know it and knew it then, resided at one time or another. So it had a history which paralleled in its way the nation's history. So right from the start, the minute I walked into the building as a public servant, it rang bells for me, because I never actually imagined in a million years that I would be a public servant. Any ambition I had was either one, to be a singer, which my children put paid to very quickly, because every time I tried to, I sang at home, all four of them would go like this. So that was set aside. And of course, I'd always wanted to be a writer, but there were problems with that for me because I was American born. And I got caught up in the women's movement and became what became known as a Femocrat. In fact, arguably the first Femocrat, because after Gough Whitlam was elected in 1972, he appointed for the first time ever a woman's advisor on his staff. And that was a world first, but she needed bureaucratic backup. That was Elizabeth Reed. And I applied for the position. I had been a public service journalist by then, and I got it. And that meant that I was catapulted to the top of the organization. And to say that I didn't know all that much is probably an understatement. But I walked into the building, which was the hub of the government. It had a very, it was much more powerful then than it is today, when the prime minister's offices have taken over, the ministerial offices have taken most of the power away. But when I went there, I was walking into hallowed halls. But the walls were very run down because they were going to get rid of the building. So it was my induction to being a true Australian.
Oh, you wrote in your introduction to the book that when you walked in, the building galvanized me. The minute I walked into it, I wanted to write its story. Could you give us an idea, like what about the physical aspects of the building really galvanized you and required that you?
Well, the first thing that struck me was how run down it was. Because although it was a fine piece of architecture and is to this day, the bureaucrats at the time felt it was not modern enough. And the building was the roof leaked in places, and pigeons dropped their droppings on the desk. And I mean, there were all kinds of crazy things. I mean, I remember in one of the corridors, just a long cord with the bare bulb swinging on the end of it. And the front part, the entry was, tarted up a bit, and there was a picture of the Queen, a portrait of the Queen. Apart from that, it was absolutely bare, except for a curving stairwell that took you up into the executive area. And so this was 2 years after the dismissal, not when I went, but the book is written two years afterwards. And so the main character is based partly on me, except at least my experience, but not me, because I had to turn myself into an Australian woman. But her name was, or is, Cassandra, Cassie, as she's called. And so the book is really her attempt to write the story of what happened and how each of the characters dealt with the aftermath of the dismissal.
Mm. Yeah, I was very interested in the Cassie and how autobiographical that character was from your point of view as a writer. So she in the book presented as a femocrat. So I actually didn't know that femocrat was a very Australian term, which is a mashup of basically feminist and bureaucrat, if I'm correct. So you were one of the original femocrats. How did your role as a femocrat evolve over time, and what did the role actually entail? What did you have to do?
Well, we started from the ground up. I mean, that was what was so exciting. When the Whitlam government came in, it came in on a wave of reform. The Labor had been kept out of office for 23 years. The government that was in power before then was, from my perspective today, was not a bad government. I mean, they were supportive of many things that have been whittled back disastrously today. But it was stodgy, and on social issues, pretty backward. And so when the Whitlam government came in, it was unbelievably exciting. And having appointed a women's advisor, what I was tasked with was to build the bureaucratic support for that position. And Elizabeth Reed was in Whitlam's office. So we started with our major focus was childcare. We found funding for health centers, women's health centers, women's refuges. Many of the programs that were then refurbished during the Hawke years, but then inevitably whittled back once the coalition got back into office. And so it was a big job. Nobody had really done the work that we'd done before. And that's what made it very exciting. And needless to say, we were considered either a puzzle or a threat at the time.
So you were trying to juggle your role as a femocrat, as a bureaucrat working for women's rights and trying to establish these services on their behalf at the same time as you were a single mum for a lot of the time as well. So you were juggling many roles yourself. What challenges did you come up against?
Well, that's one thing that I had in common with Cassie. Because she's a single mother too, although she has the support of her mother who is there, Lillian. And before I came to Canberra, I got an insight into another kind of Australia altogether, because the first place I lived was my in-laws' pub. So I was, in 1958, when I arrived, I was immediately introduced to that particularly Australian institution, the corner pub. And so I learned about, and my father-in-law, who was the publican, he had also was a bookie. So I learned a lot about a different kind of Australia from the kind I would meet up in Canberra. So I was able to draw a lot on those characters and Cassie's background to create her as distinct from me. And of course, she had red hair and green eyes, which I'd always wanted. But, you know, that's the joy of being a writer. You can be these things. So, but I do want to make the point that so much has changed for women today, even though, again, it's under threat and it's always fragile. But what the advantage we've had as servants for millennial is that we've watched very closely. And when I went into the building, and when I sat down nearly 3 years later to start writing the book, and the Whitlam government had been dismissed by the Governor General, and it was an incredibly tumultuous time in Australian history. What I wanted to write was not so much about the women's story, although that was there, and that's a continuing theme right throughout the novel, but I wanted to write what women saw. I wanted to write about how women perceived government. In other words, in a much more vernacular way, I wanted to nail them. And that was different too. There weren't many women who were doing that. We were writing about ourselves, yes, but we weren't writing about the male world from a feminist perspective.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I was wondering about that in terms of the structure of the book. So you've got 5 main chapters with 5 or 6 main characters. So you're telling the story from a few different points of view. Is that connected to this idea of wanting to interrogate those characters from a different perspective?
Oh yes, because theoretically and structurally, it's her story. She's telling it, although she's the third person narrator in each of them. But I also was very influenced by a book that nobody has ever heard of today, or very few, maybe some, it's come back. And that was John Dos Passos, well, Manhattan Transfer and then USA. And he was able, well, I think it's a wonderful book, but because he married fiction and nonfiction, which I didn't do, but he had characters who, and you went back and forth to the characters through the length of what is a much larger book than Westbrook. But at the time, this was not acceptable in Australian literary, the literary scene, because it was a different narrative arc. And today, nobody would have any problem with this. But there were quite a few critics who did.
I was about that. So the book was originally published in 83, so only a few years really after the events that it, sort of fictionalizes, sets out. What was the reaction to the book in terms of the subject matter it presented, but also in terms of its sort of innovative structure?
Well, there was, is it a novel is it stories? That was one thing. And the other thing was, it was set in Canberra. And there was an antipathy that was, I think, still prevails today, that Australians hold towards its national capital, which I found quite unbelievable, having grown up in America and having had a great uncle who worked in Washington. And it was incredible to me that the train to catch a train from the capital, Canberra, to Melbourne, you had to get a bus to a nearby country town to pick up the train. I mean, this was, to me, that was so symbolic of how people didn't really treasure the Canberra, nor did they treasure the public service. And that was really the driving force for writing the novel, because I learned what a valuable institution it was, is, and some of the bureaucrats I met, mostly men, were wholly admirable people. Not all of them, but there were some gems. And it seemed to me that this was very distinctively Australian. The idea that government was there to serve the people was very strong, even among the conservatives of the day. And unfortunately, that's over the past 40 years or so, that's an approach that's been lost.
Yes, I remember reading in your introduction, you were saying, of course, looking back and rereading your own book, that's always going to be a difficult thing to do, because there's probably so many things you'd like to get in there now and change and alter. But you said one of the things that you still really stood by and loved was your characters, because you were outlining these characters who really had the public interests at heart, you know, as public servants and as politicians. And so you still found them very admirable as characters, even if they were flawed as people. Do you still think there are such people in politics and the public service, people who have the public interests mainly at heart?
Well, today is not the day to talk about that, when we've learned about, you know, the head of the Australia Post sending her executive officers $3,000 Cartier watches because they'd done a good job. I mean, no, it's not the same. It's not the same today. Unfortunately, after Howard came in, everything, including the public service, was to be modeled on business. You know, the idea that the private sector was efficient and the best way to deal with government is to whittle it back as much as you can. And now we've got to the point where, you know, there's just rampant corruption in the government. This was not the case. At the state level, there was more, but certainly not at the federal level. Not in my day.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Actually, you present the government of the time. They're certainly not perfect. Is a little bit of a sort of a doomed Camelot, in the sense that there was it wasn't a perfect system, but there was actual genuine support for arts, for scientists, for the sciences, and for women, and for social justice, and that
and the arts.
Yes, the arts, absolutely, yeah, and that has that was a sort of a golden era, which, as you say, has gradually since then become further eroded. It's more of a sort of economic rationalism that runs now. Do you see that that sense of applying a business model to government, privatizing everything? Is that really the root of what we're seeing now in government?
Well, it's certainly a big part of it. Certainly. I mean, the idea that, well, take the idea about executive salaries. I mean, you know, we've got these in the private sector, incredibly inflated salaries. And the idea is that these people are worth it. And, you know, this is all, you know, bull dust. I mean, you know, we know that. But the argument now, and in fact, Karen Andrews used it this morning on Insiders before we had this webinar, is that, well, how else can we get good people to work in the public sector unless we match what they could get in the private sector? Well, we know the answer to that. The answer is that there are some people who are, you know, who do things because they feel it's important to do. You know, they're not poor by any means, but the measure of their worth is not wholly monetary. And it's the culture. We've now have a culture that this is desirable. But I guess you could say that when Westblock was written, that was threatened, but it hadn't actually occurred. And but that was a long time ago. And I do want to say that I never expected this to happen. This was not my idea. It was Jan McDonald's idea. Needless to say, I was thrilled and honored that she was willing and to undertake it. But I thought, well, this was my apprentice novel. I mean, yes, I'd always wanted to write, but I hadn't actually done anything substantial until I resigned in protest when the Office of the Status of, or Women's Affairs as it was kicked out of prime ministers. And that was my moment. I could make a stink and I could go back to what I really wanted to do. And so, you know, I thought, how am I going to face a novel that, if I were writing today with the enhanced skills such as they are, that I have today, how am I going to face having that out in the public again? And there are two answers to that. I told Jen I didn't want a word to be changed. There were some words that had to be changed because of widows and publishing issues, but I had to live with the record. This was my first novel. And the second thing was when we went through it to proofread it, and that was the big job because the scanning introduced a lot of gremlins and what have you. But I thought, well, this isn't, you know, there were moments when I actually laughed out loud. I mean, for example, a lot about Jonathan Rowe is about an economist who was brought in to bring in effectively economic rationalism into the service. And so everything, all the language has to do with economics. I mean, it's sort of symbolic. Everything was symbolic because I thought I was a poet then. But so he goes and has therapy because his girlfriend is pregnant, and he finds he doesn't want the baby. It doesn't. It just throws him because she's quite willing to go ahead and have the baby without him, but he doesn't believe that. He doesn't know what to think. So as Bronwyn gets bigger and bigger, he gets more and more anxious. And so he goes to a therapist who is it's run by the public service. It's a public service, local Canberra service. And so as his therapy progresses, the service itself is getting run down according to the principles he lives by. Everything was about choice, you know, and this was happening, and he had no choice. So this was very difficult. And so the therapy is a form of transactional analysis, and there's a lot of role play. And there's some very funny bits in it, very, very funny bits. I thought, you know, I was...
Could you read us some bits? Do you have a little tidbit?
Well, a lot of when we were talking about how we would proceed, so much of this book is in dialogue. So I'll just read a bit about Jonathan. And he's talking to the therapist, whose name is Bob Miller, and the therapist has him talking to beanbags, and he finds this very difficult. I mean, he's an economist. How can, and the people that he's supposed to be dealing with and are causing him all this angst are green beanbags, you see. Now, I won't read you the whole thing because that could be very boring, but just this is about, they've gone through weeks of this, and at last, Miller says, Jonathan says, I'm lonely. And this is Miller. A common complaint, Canberra's notoriously bad for single people. How do you know I'm single? You haven't mentioned your marriage. Most people do if they have one. Oh, no relationships? Well, yes. Anyone special? Jonathan smiled, remembering Bronwyn standing in the doorway at that party. He glanced at Miller and told him, relief in his eyes, you could say you've put your finger on it. How long have you known her? Not long. I met her shortly after I came here. She lives in the neighborhood. Can you tell me about her? Jonathan reached for a cigarette. She works in Social Security. Bright, I think. She was married before, has a boy about 9. She used to go to a lot of meetings. That's settled down a little now. What sort of meetings? She holds an office in the union, but she isn't standing again. Why not? Jonathan paused. It'll be too much, I guess. They do have a bit on their plate. He looked over to the beanbag, where Bronwyn seemed to be nodding. She's having a baby, he said. I see, said Miller. Tell her what you think. I have many times. Try it now. Jonathan scratched his beard. They'd been over it so often. He felt he hadn't the heart to drag himself through it again. Go on. I don't want this, he said, Miller writing it all down on the pad. I don't want to be tied to anyone. I don't believe this is what life should be. We should be free to make choices. Then why have you chosen her? I didn't, Jonathan cried. I bumped into her at the ShopRite at Hughes. And then it goes on.
Oh. Oh, that is very funny. It's very interesting to see, the very dry economist mind trying to grapple with the green beanbag.
Yeah, well, anyway, yeah, so there's a lot of dialogue in this. And one of the chapters I like a lot is about Henry Beeker, who is he's involved on a marketing mission for Australian uranium. And he goes to Europe on this mission. Now, there are two, one's a marketing, one's a safeguard mission, because the government hopes to be able to sell Australian uranium. But they haven't actually got the recommendations from an inquiry that's going on. So it's all very speculative. And these guys go to Europe, and there's some very funny bits in that too. But they meet up with the guy in Brussels who tells a bureaucrat. We have femocrats and bureaucrats and bureaucrats. And this guy says, we don't want it. Effectively, we don't want it. You missed your chance. Now we're getting it from the Canadians, and your price isn't right. So it's a lot about bureaucratic stuff. But somebody did give me the compliment to say at the time that I was able to turn the most unlikely material into art. So this is the story of how Henry Beeker decides that he is going to fight against the government adopting, deciding to go sell the uranium. And it's a lot about what happens at interdepartmental committees, which, you know, have the very mention of the name has eyeballs rolling. But it's very funny, really, what happens, and sad, but funny. And but the beginning too is the story of George Harland, who is the sort of old-fashioned bureaucrat, and how he is confronted with his daughter. And so that's how I bring in the whole Aboriginal theme. And when I was reading this, I thought, my God, you know, it really was Cassandra, because a lot of the issues that now are uppermost today were dealt with. And the daughter is confronting her father about a lot of things, and he's trying to understand. So in a sense, that sets the theme for the whole book, because, yeah, it's like, it's the Athena theme. She jumps out of Jupiter's head. And
I really love that sense that you were given a compliment, that you managed to make something that most people would assume is boring and roll their eyes at. Really fascinating. Actually, these days, I think people see that more and more. There are so many TV series and, you know, things about the intrigue of politics and what happens in the back room. All the actions really take place, you know. So I think you're one of the first writers in Australia, absolutely, to put the humanity of opera and drama into that. And really, it makes a lot of sense. People are coming with skills, or they come in with ambition, or both, and then they have to compromise and they have to negotiate, and it actually creates a beautiful, complex pool of stories, you know, to dip into, which you've done beautifully. I just wanted to, we've got a few burning questions from our audience, so we'll get to that in a second. I just wanted to ask you one last quick question, just a personal question from me. Which is your favorite character in the book?
oh, look, I don't. I have 5 children, as it turns out, and I don't have a favorite child, and I can't have a favorite character. Just one point, you know, when I was in this very unusual place, I was been an oddball. There weren't many women up on my level. And I started to write more. I kept a journal, and to record all the government stuff. And it was awful to read when I looked at it. It was just wrong and boring and everything. But I stopped doing it. At one point, I stopped doing that, and I just started writing pen portraits of the people that I was working with. And just Henry Beeker, for example, was based on a character who, and none of the people knew that I was writing this, based on a man named John Enfield. And, you know, I knew him, I knew what his issues were, but I kept very quiet about what I was doing. And it turned out that a lot of the things that I guessed about what he was thinking and doing were actually true. And so it was a little embarrassing for a while, but after a while, he claimed the fact that he was Henry Beeker with great pride. So much so that when he died, Jack Waterford, who's from the Canberra Times, wrote an obituary and mentioned that John Enfield was Henry Beeker in West Block. So there you are.
Oh, that's incredible. I think, yeah, I just love the way you bring the humanity, and the book is very, very character driven, and it's as if there was a feminist spy in the West Block. You know, you infiltrated, you made changes, and you changed people's opinions, but also their hearts. You know, and you watched and observed, and you showed us it all from a perspective, which is what makes I think the West Block so incredibly fresh still today. I would love to talk more, but I think I need to shut up now and hand over to Barbie because we've got some burning questions from our audience. So over to you, Barbie.
Thank you, Michele. And just a welcome to everyone who wasn't here when we first started. It's so lovely to see so many people here to celebrate the publication of the new edition of Sara's West Block. So thank you to everyone all around Australia. Now, we do have some questions which people have submitted, and please feel free to continue submitting them, because anything that's not answered today, it will be possible for us to send to Sara, and she can answer them for you in email form, which we'll post to websites. I do want to also remind you, I have your attention that on the For Pity's Sake website, forpitysake.com.au, there is a wonderful offer from Jen McDonald, the publisher of this book, of a 25% off if you order the book online. And the first 30 people to order online will also receive a gift from For Pity's Sake of one of these beautiful Luby-Loo travel candles with a book signature on it. So if I may put first this question from Bryony, or maybe I'll just prepare you, Sara, because we've had a request for you to read the birth scene. And I will read that first as a bit of warning and then come back to Bryony's question. Moya is saying, I don't want to upend plans. So if it's not possible, that's fine. But the thing I remember about West Block is the birth scene. If, Sara, you could read a little bit of that. She says she hasn't read anything as good about birth since then. So since 1983, you've topped the birth description score. So just a bit of notice if you need to find that reference, Sara. But meanwhile, there's a question from Bryony, which asks you to talk a little bit more about John Dos Passos's inventive use of language and how that has influenced your own writing.
Well, look, as I have explained, I've got a hearing problem, but I think the question was about John Dos Passos and his inventiveness in language. Well, I was bowled over by this book. I didn't read it when I was in my teens, when other people I knew were, but I came to it rather late in my 30s. And it's interesting because Dos Passos was part of the trio with Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Dos Passos. They were the three authors, American authors of the 20s. And all of whom I like, by the way, for very different reasons. But Dos Passos kind of slipped off the radar because he was far more intellectual than the other two, I think you could say. And his vision was far broader. What Fitzgerald was able to do was to concentrate many of the themes that Dos Passos dealt with into that one gem, The Great Gatsby. But Dos Passos's vision was far more expansive. And so, but what he was dealing with, wanted to deal with, was a society and the coming of mass society. So it's the first of these experimental books was Manhattan Transfer, which had the same kind of structure of just having a group of characters, and you vacillated between, or oscillated is a better word, between each of them. So you got a picture of a society. It wasn't just, you had the personal, but you also had the political. And that was in the 70s, 60s, 70s, that was the feminist war cry, the personal is political. So that inspired me. And his language, I had to cut back a bit on the inventiveness of that language. It was too much for my publisher then, Penguin, to have the words squashed together like Dos Passos and Faulkner did. So I hope that answers the question, but it just blew my mind. If you can get a hold of either of these books, please do. My copy is falling apart.
Thank you, Sarah. Now, there was that request from Moya to read the section, the birth section. She feels that your description of birth in West Block was the best she's read ever. Can you find that?
I thought you, when you said it before, I thought you said birds. And
No,
anyway,
birds.
well, I have to divulge a secret. The book originally was dedicated to my son, Sam. And Sam was, Sam was born under much the same conditions as the baby David was born in that book. Because I did exactly what Bronwyn did. I was in a relationship and I found I was pregnant, and I dealt with that before in an abortion, and I thought this time I'll just go with it. And there's an interesting story because I was told or asked by my partner, who we were not living together, to ask my friends to see what they thought about my going ahead with what would be my fifth child. Like, haven't you had enough? And so I did. And every single one of them told me about their story. They weren't interested in my story, but they told me about their stories about birthing and motherhood. And so the one person who was a friend of mine, is a friend of mine and was writing at the same time, was Blanche Delpuget. And so when I got in touch with her with this question, should I, what do you think? She was the only one who came up with an answer that related to me personally. And she said words which I'll never forget. You know, I think this child has something to do with your creativity. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how. And that's when I started writing West Block on the widow's pension. Is that? And I'm very happy that you love the birth. And I'm also happy to announce that Sam, who was the baby 3 months old when I started writing my very first book, is now a father himself. The baby Herbie, was born on October the 3rd, 62 years from the day I first arrived in Australia. So.
Wonderful moment and a wonderful congruence. There is a question from John. What, if any, of the dreams of the 1970s and 80s bureaucrats have been unfulfilled by the untimely death of Susan Rana this month?
Well, what can I say? I mean, like most of us, I was deeply shocked by her untimely and to a degree, unnecessary death. I was, right back then, I was helping her campaign to become a member of the House and then later the Senate. So we go way back, Susan, and it was a terrible loss, Susan. And I think my only thing I can say about what's changed now, what we did do, and this was Elizabeth Reed as well as many, many other fine, brave women at the time, is that we've changed the aspirations of young women. When I was in my 20s, 30s, the thought of being a writer would seem impossible, just an impossible dream. If I had a job, it would have been being a teacher. I'd given up all hope of ever being a singer. But now nobody thinks anything about a young girl saying, I would like to do this. The sad thing is that there are still many barriers in the way, but the feminist voice has not died. If anything, it's been rekindled, because as women become more and more aware of the obstacles that remain, the injustices that remain, the terrible scourge of domestic violence, and what's happened with childcare, making it completely inaccessible for most people, or for many people, with a 90% marginal tax rate. I mean, this is what has happened, is that many of the things that were done, that were started, were truncated and whittled down. And yeah, and Susan, no one did more than Susan to forward the movement. And as I say, I mean, she was the one who got an affirmative action program undertaken by the Labour Party. So now we have, what, nearly 50% of the parliamentarians, Labour parliamentarians, being women. There was no one in the House of Representatives, no woman in the House of Representatives when I went into Parliament. I mean, not Parliament, the public servant. So I hope that happened.
Indeed. Sarah, Michele, we are going to be wrapping up now. I want to thank you, Sarah, for the book in its original form and for having it reissued in this beautiful new edition by For Pity's Sake Publishing.
Can I interrupt briefly?
Yes.
I have to give credit to Barbie, who was the designer of this beautiful cover and the everything about it. So thank you, Barbie, for that. That was a special gift.
Oh, thank you. I feel privileged to have worked on it, Sarah, as I do with all the things I work on with Jen McDonald, For Pity's Sake Publishing, a wonderful publisher with a great ethos and a great work ethic. And I want to thank Michele as well for such wonderful questions this morning, engendering this really fascinating discussion. And it's been elucidating for all of us. But thank you so much to everyone, and thank you to Jen McDonald for being with us here as well this morning, as she is always. The work that she's put into this book and into the work of many other authors, including me, is phenomenal and much appreciated. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely day and goodbye.